Good evening again, everybody. As you know or suspect, this is week 2 of Next Gen Security, Next Gen Network Security, I should say, and we welcome you along to that. Just while everybody's filing in, I will just play a little bit of an IT Masters promo video for the next minute and a half, and we will, as always, come back with the live part of the presentation once a few more people have filed into the room. But welcome on this cool Thursday evening. And don't forget to let us know who you are in the chat and where you're from and say hello.
What appealed to me was that it is all designed for busy professionals.
The course empowered me to make better decisions.
The real-world experience that IT Masters lecturers brought to each subject made their subjects tangible and relatable.
Nearly everything was directly applicable to my work. I knew people who had studied at ITM, and it really aligned with what I needed in my job.
So, apologies in some respects for that advertisement. I'd like to welcome you all here again to, as I said, week 2 of Next Gen Network Security. As always, my name's Shane Murphy and I'm your host for tonight. Lil is our moderator and we'll keep an eye on things in the chat. If you've got questions during this week's session, please remember to put them in the Q&A part of the thing. It's just down the bottom of the screen to the right of the share button or the raise hand button. By the way, don't bother using the raise hand button. We use the chat and the questions to answer things. With the questions, if you have a question for Ian or anybody on the team, then please put that in the Q&A. If it's a question about, process things, what's happening with the recordings, etc., Lil will be putting that information up pretty regularly in the chat, but you can also speak to Lil directly through the chat. So without any further ado, I think it's probably time to get started and to welcome the main man, Mr. Ian Robertson, to continue where he left off last week. How are you tonight, Ian?
I'm well. And thank you, Shane. And good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone on the call. So,
yes, 5:30 in the US apparently. 5:30 a.m.
a.m. Yes. Committed being up that early. Well done. So, yeah. So let's get into it tonight. So once again, we're sort of taking straight from the syllabus for the Palo Alto Networks certified entry-level network technician role. So tonight we're going to be focusing on a few different topics, and as Shane has said, please do keep the Q&A running. Please feel free to ask questions, and we'll get through as many of them as we sensibly can within the time allowed. And we'll try to keep this as interactive as we reasonably can, I guess. So tonight we're going to be covering a bunch of topics related to essentially the networking bones of network security. So we're going to be talking a lot about systems and technologies that relate to everything below layer 4 in the OSI stack. I actually saw some really good commentary in the forums around the OSI stack. But for those that don't remember or don't know, essentially, networking is built up in the form of layers, starting with layer 1, which is the physical layer. There's the wires or the wireless in the case of a wireless network. going all the way up to layer 7, which is the application layer. Now, these are somewhat abstract terminologies, and there's a lot of overlap. There's components that look like layer 3 but really sit somewhere else, and we'll talk about those in some detail as we go through. But the long and the short of it is, we're going to be talking a lot about networking and related technologies. And if at any time you need to ask questions or need something clarified, please do ask. This is the space that I've worked in for a very, very long time. So it's very easy for me to forget that not everyone has 24 years of experience working in this space. So please do ask away. There is no such thing as a silly question. Now, Q&A questions, please put into the Q&A box. The chat is for chat, and it comes through as a bit of a flood. So, the way to get your questions answered is to put them in the Q&A window, as I think Shane is busy typing to you, Paul, at the moment. Okay, so as I said, we're going to be talking about networking stacks. Let's start with talking about network components. So for those that are already working in the networking space, these first few slides are probably going to be fairly old hat for you. But look, this is a good refresher all the same. So let's start with hubs. Now, hubs are not something you would typically see in a modern network. These really did their dash in the 1990s and maybe the early 2000s. But I know of a few networks around the place that still use them. Now, in terms of the layer 1 to 7 OSI stack, these are about as dumb as they get. These are layer 1 devices. They're purely designed to provide wiring between, adjacent network components. So 2 PCs, PC plus a printer, etc., etc. Now, that said, there's still an important fundamental function. They basically connect devices together into a single network. Now, devices, we're talking computers, we're talking printers, we're talking all of those things, including firewalls and routers, that when collected together become a network. Now, you can not unreasonably think of the air as a hub when it comes to a wireless network. So the ether, the air, the vacuum between devices that wireless networks travel over, that is in many senses a hub in terms of the way it behaves. And by that I mean if any device on a hub network wants to talk to any other device, it can just start talking and everybody will hear that conversation. So from a security point of view, there is no security. From a transport point of view, that's very inefficient. Think about being in a large meeting room where everyone's trying to have a conversation at once. Doesn't take long before you can't hear the person next to you due to the din of everybody around you. Well, in a hub-based network, that's the default. Now, hubs were always really, they were very cheap to make. They're probably the simplest form of networking connectivity. But as I said, they're very, very insecure. Everyone hears every conversation. And for those of a certain age that might have lived in rural areas that used a party line system, where essentially when you picked up the phone and someone else was on it, you could hear their conversation, that's pretty much what a hub provides. Now, I mention all of this for the simple fact that there are certain, what I'm going to call failure modes, which will turn a network switch, which we'll talk about next, back into a hub. So from a network security and a network transport point of view, the default behavior of a switch when things go wrong is to become a hub. Now we get into network switches. These, when we're talking about layer 1 through 7, the OSI stack, these fit in at layer 2. So they're a little bit smarter. They physically look like a hub. They still have multiple plugs on the front. They're typically the sort of thing that, these days you'd go to your local, favorite retail computer store and pick up to connect multiple devices together. In days of old, it would have been a hub. These days, it will almost always be a switch of some sort. Again, exactly like a hub, they connect devices. But instead of having every device talking to everybody simultaneously, regardless of who actually wants to hear the conversation, these forward traffic only where the network, where the traffic is needed. So essentially, conversations become one-to-one between two devices. That in turn means that if you've got, say, 4 devices on a switch, each pair of devices can talk to the other pair without any issues, without any collisions in networking terms, but also, just as importantly, without, by default, that conversation being heard or being listened to by other parties within the network. So to a point, that gives a little bit more natural security. But as I alluded to already, there are ways to make a switch become a hub and behave like one. And obviously, from a network point of view, that becomes a bit of a problem. In terms of a telephone equivalent, this is equivalent to a local telephone exchange where you dial a number and you talk to just that person. You don't, when you pick up the handset, expect to hear your neighbor having a conversation. Moving up a little bit further, now network routers, network firewalls, because many firewalls will behave like a router, will connect multiple networks together. So far, we've talked about connecting multiple devices together into a network. Now we're talking about taking 2 networks and connecting them together. Now, take multiple networks together, you end up with an internetwork, i.e. the internet. So this is where you get your scale from. There's a limit to the size of a network, a given network. Typically, you wouldn't, in a standard enterprise environment, see more than a couple of hundred devices connected into a single network. This, however, obviously doesn't work when you're talking about the entire internet. So the entire internet is built up by connecting multiple networks together using routers. Now, routers in this context are important because a common use case for a next generation firewall is also to provide routing functions. So routers, like a switch, will only forward traffic where it's needed. This makes them quite efficient because they won't forward traffic that doesn't need to go elsewhere. And in telephone terms, this is very similar to the central exchange. That is the exchange that will give you international direct dial or area code dialing. Now, many switches have routing functions, just like many firewalls have routing functions. So if you've ever heard the term multi-layer switch, that is in essence a router. And similarly, a typical Palo Alto next generation firewall is capable of performing routing and therefore being a router. Are there layer 3 switches, Roman asks? That is an excellent question. Yes. Yes, it is. Yes, a multi-layer switch is a layer 3 switch. So essentially, what a multi-layer switch does is combine the functions of a router, the ability to talk to multiple networks, with the ability to talk to individual devices within a network. Most switches that have what's called virtual LAN or VLAN functionality do provide that functionality, and that in turn makes them a layer 3 switch. What is the difference between layer 3 switches and a router? That is also an excellent question. The main difference these days is the number of physical ports, the number of connections that the device supports. So a multi-layer switch or a layer 3 switch will typically have 24 or 48 physical ports on the front panel, and therefore you can connect to 24 or 48 other devices, be they switches, be they PCs, printers, what have you. Whereas a typical router will have a handful of ports, maybe 10 or 20. Now, that's a very gross generalization. Obviously, high-end routers can have many hundreds of ports. High-end switches can have many, many hundreds of ports. And low-end switches, which can perform routing, will also tend to only have a handful of ports just based on the physical size of the device. But as a very broad rule of thumb, that's the easiest way to differentiate between them. Okay, let's have a look at these other questions before we move on.
Okay, so routing function-wise, they don't have any difference?
Not really, no. A dedicated router may have higher routing performance, so it may support bigger networks of networks in particular. That is more IP addresses, bigger connections to the internet, etc. Whereas a multi-layer switch will typically support smaller networks, maybe the size of an enterprise rather than the internet. But these days, there isn't a lot between the two once you get into multi-layer switch land, for the simple fact that the silicon to do this work, the network hardware to do it, is fairly standardized and generally provided by a fairly small number of vendors, fairly small number of merchants.
Okay, here's a quick one. The ports you mentioned that routers have on the front, the 24, 48, etc.
And different to the ports like 8080.
8080, yep.
That is a really good point, and it goes to the overloading or reuse of terminology. So when I talk about the ports, the 24 to 30 ports or the 24 or 48 ports on the front of a switch, I'm talking about the physical network jacks, the RJ45 connectors on them. So they're a port. They're a connection to another device, typically in the case of a modern Ethernet network, connecting to, say, a Cat6 cable or similar. Now, the ports that we talked about last week, like 8080 or 443, they're a logical construct. They're a network port or a TCP port, which is essentially, the way to think of it is essentially a channel or a, what's another possible terminology? A phone number, if you will, that a device will answer on when a connection is made to that port. So rather than being a physical thing, they're a logical construct that is used to determine where traffic is supposed to go when it comes to the network operating system or the operating system of a computer. Does that make some sense?
It does to me.
Yeah,
and I know nothing, let's be clear. Wasim has said, so somebody like Microsoft Google would only have 200 devices in that case, which I think is being facetious.
So it's a fair question. It's a fair comment. No, a typical local area network, and we actually get straight into local area and wide area networks next. A typical network segment might only have 200 devices on it. That would be a pretty normal figure for pretty much any local area network segment. Now, a large enterprise will, and Google is certainly one of those, will typically have many thousands of devices. But that's the thing. To connect networks together, you need routers. If you've got more than a couple of hundred devices, you're going to be using a router at some point to connect those networks together just to make them manageable. Someone like Google is going to have millions of devices connected to their networks in plural. And I can assure you, Google don't have a single network. They have many, many, many thousands of networks within their environment.
Yes, I would hate to think what their environment looks like. Let's just move on, but we'll just answer a couple of VLAN questions first. So
Yes.
Some layer 3 switches do not support configs from layer 2 switches like VLAN. Why is that? And where do VLAN sit in the network stack, which I assume is layer 2?
So absolutely. So I'll answer the second part first. VLANs are essentially a layer 2 construct. They're a way of segregating and virtualizing physical networks. So if you've got two devices that are sitting on the same physical device, say connected to the same physical switch, but you don't want them to talk to each other, let's, for argument's sake, you've got a guest network port sitting next to a PC that's used for corporate use. You obviously don't want the guest network port talking to the same assets as your corporate PC. The way you deal with that is to use a virtual LAN or a VLAN. So we'll talk about LANs in a moment, local area networks, and a virtual LAN is just a way at layer 2 to separate and segregate those. And then to answer the second part of that question, which is why do some layer 3 switches not support layer 2 constructs? That really comes down to cost and engineering considerations on the part of the manufacturer. As a rule, any switch or router that supports layer 3 should by right support anything at layer 2, but various engineering decisions, various cost decisions may mean that some features are just not enabled or not available.
Great. Let's keep going. I think we've got lots of router questions, but I think we can come back to them.
Some people are asking about MPLS. That's a whole topic in itself. That's a 4-week course just right there. Okay, so LAN, WAN, and SD-WAN we'll talk about now. And look, a lot of what we've covered so far builds straight into this. So local area networks, we've already covered that, even though we haven't necessarily used that exact term. So a local area network would typically be made up of switches in a modern environment and is typically seen in a physical sense within a building, maybe within multiple buildings inside a campus. Some universities will have a local area network that extends to the size of a small campus, but most commonly we're talking about a construct that live inside a building and often inside a single floor within a building. They're typically private in the sense that they're not something that an internet service provider would typically provide to an organization. They're typically provided by the organization that's using them. They're typically the sort of thing that in a moderate to large organization, the IT team of that organization will own and operate it. They're typically very, very high speed, particularly these days. It's not uncommon in an enterprise to see link speeds between switches of 100 gigabits per second these days. Those speeds are on average doubling every 14 to 18 months. So it won't be long before we see 400 gigabit per second links being not uncommon. And these, of course, as I've already said, use switches. Less common is to use hubs, but certainly back in the 90s, everything was connected via hubs. And to get beyond the local area network, you're either using a router or you're using a multi-layer switch that is providing routing. So in strict terms, you're using a router in some form. Now, local area networks, they predominantly work at layer 2. So they talk about switching in the OSI model. They're working at the data link layer. That is to say, they're two devices are talking to each other using a media access control address, a MAC address. Now, there is, however, of course, some routing here, particularly the instant you need to talk out to the internet. There's not a lot of isolation within the network. So from a security point of view, while two devices in a switched network should only hear the traffic that they need to hear, there's multiple ways to break that model and listen to things that you shouldn't listen to, as it were. And in turn, there's a certain amount of trust implied here. Think about a corporate network. You don't generally tolerate people coming in from outside and plugging into it, and from there doing things that you shouldn't do. So there's a certain amount of implied trust in using and having them. But having said that, there's also a potential visibility problem here, a potential blind spot. There are ways to monitor network traffic, of course, but the same thing that leads to very, very high network speeds, gigabit per second network links, for example, does make it somewhat challenging to reliably see the traffic within the network. And we do talk quite a lot about insider threats as a part of this course more generally. That said, particularly for someone who works in this space, they're very, very easy to manage and they're relatively easy to troubleshoot. And above all else, they're cheap per port. You would be looking at around $5 to $7 per port at scale for a large local area network in terms of capital cost to deploy. So they're very, very cheap compared to, say, a wide area network, which is what we get into next. Any more questions worth looking at here?
I think let's keep going for a
Keep
little
chatting?
while. And
Yep. Not a problem. So now we get into wide area networks. Now these typically counterpoint to the local area network. These are inter-building constructs. These are, between campuses, between buildings, possibly between cities or states as well, and in some cases international as well. They're different to the internet in the sense that they're private to organization. They're often provided by a managed services provider. Maybe an internet service provider provides them to you. Often they use a virtual private network construct. We'll talk about VPNs at length in this material. Now, all of this points to them also tending to be an order of magnitude slower than a typical local area network capacity. So where you might use 100 gigabit links in a large local area network, you're probably not going to see much over 10 gigabits per second in an equivalent wide area network, with some notable exceptions. And wide area networks are almost always made only of routers. Again, they're almost always pure layer 3. For those that are familiar with MPLS, I'm going to skip that discussion because that complicates things significantly. And yes, it is possible to do things like carry switched traffic, layer 2 traffic, over a wide area network. But for these purposes, we're talking about a layer 3 construct. Now, within the wide area network, there's better isolation, so we can basically better assure and guarantee that traffic that is supposed to remain separate does so. And while within that area network, like the LAN, there is a certain amount of implicit trust. That is, we can assume that the traffic that's on the wide area network is supposed to be there. We also assume that anything outside it is highly untrusted. And generally speaking, these same facts, along with the slightly lower speed, give you a much better visibility of the way the network is being used. That said, managing them is a bit harder. You need to know what you're doing. You need to know routing and so on. And in turn, that tends to, particularly in a large network, start to get very complicated. And troubleshooting, particularly if you're dealing with third-party links, can be very, very difficult. You end up having a lot of arguments with people over whose fault is what. They also, as well as being an order of magnitude slower than a traditional local area network as a rule, they also tend to be about an order of magnitude more expensive as well. So you can think of that as being potentially 2 orders of magnitude more expensive for the same amount of throughput. So let's look at some options here. Which is which? Not sure if we want to do this, probably not in the Q&A window, maybe in the chat window. Let's start. So a network within one floor of a building. We're talking LAN or WAN here. Yep, got a few that have already punched out the word LAN. That's good. That's brilliant. Within a single tenanted building. My scroll's not keeping up. Yep, that's a LAN as well. A single network within a multi-tenanted building. So one occupant, let's say one floor in a corporate office building that has other businesses on other floors. Also a LAN. The network within the Bathurst campus of Charles Sturt University, or pick your own favorite university. It is also a LAN. The network between campuses would be a wide area network. And Telstra or Verizon or BT, what is their network? That's a trick question. It's not. It's not a wide area network. It's an internetwork. But we'll talk about that later anyway. That was just a deliberate a trick question for which I somewhat apologize. Okay, now we talk about software-defined wide area networks. So one of the challenges with wide area networks traditionally is that you typically had to go to a managed service provider or a traditional telco and pay a lot for leased lines, as they're called, which are either a physical direct connection between multiple sites that the telco would nail up for you, or if you're lucky, they might use their own backhaul network, their own internetwork to provide that, and use multiple techniques that are beyond the scope of this course to connect that together. Now that in turn means you're paying a lot for what is essentially a glorified internet connection. So the idea behind SD-WAN was, well, what if people could just use the internet? What if people could connect themselves across the internet by, commercial grade internet connections and pay commercial rates rather than enterprise rates, and basically just know that that's going to give a good enough result 99% of the time. So that's where software-defined wide area networks come in. Essentially, they give you the same sorts of features as a traditional wide area network, but instead of using a private link provided by a private managed services provider, you just go to whichever is your favorite internet service provider, and you might use multiples depending on where your sites are, and buy a standard internet connection, and then you connect a virtual private network over the top of that to essentially provide that virtual wide area network over the top. So given the use of a virtual private network, there's a certain amount of encryption here, and we talk about VPN in more length later. And with SD-WAN, what we try to do is we use software, hence the software-defined part, to make it easier to manage. As I said, part of the problem with wide area networks is that they are harder to manage. They take a lot more knowledge and effort and understanding than a traditional switched network does. And in turn, that kind of drives you towards all sorts of troubleshooting challenges. So if we can use software to automate a lot of that and pick better links if a better and so on, rather than having to do so manually, then all the better. One of the trade-offs though is that you typically will get best effort out of an internet connection, and in many countries, and certainly in Australia, you might find that 1 gigabit per second per site is about as much as you're going to get, unless you're willing to pay a very significant sum, as it were. Now, SD-WAN, this is really where next generation firewalls really come into their own. Yes, some routers, some traditional routers from various vendors will provide some SD-WAN functionality, but given that I've talked about virtual private networks, given that I've talked about privacy and security in this context, this really is where next generation firewalls really start to shine. You get the benefits of being able to do some routing, which you do need to be able to do in this construct, but you also get some innate ability to secure and protect traffic. SD-WAN always uses layer 3 because the internet is built around routing. SD-WAN gives you very good isolation within the network that it provides. So because of the way a firewall works and application and content awareness that we talked about last week, you also get very, very good and clear ability to separate and segregate traffic within your own network. So the same things that allow you to decide whether a particular application is allowed or denied can also assure that that application, when you're transporting traffic between your own sites, is kept separate. Now, this also gets into a concept called Zero Trust Network Access, ZTNA, or ZTNA for some listeners. And essentially what this allows you to do is assume that everything everywhere is totally untrustworthy until it proves otherwise. And we talk a lot about ZTNA later, but just understand at this point that SD-WAN and ZTNA fit side by side. That same application awareness means that SD-WAN gives you very, very good visibility, not just of what traffic is traveling over your network, but who's generating it, and even in many cases, what the traffic actually contains. So not just that it's a Word document for argument's sake, but that Word document contains, say, credit card numbers that should not be stored, for example. Designed to be easy to manage because best of all possible worlds, software is doing it all for you. Troubleshooting is generally easy, at least until your internet service provider has problems. And they're much, much, much cheaper than a traditional wide area network because you're just paying for an internet connection in broad terms. Now, does anything here ring a bell compared to the first week? I'll give you the hint. Excellent network visibility. Application, user, and content awareness is really where we're at. So obviously, this is where next-gen firewalls really shine, as I said. So many traditional, back when SD-WAN first started being a thing, around 2015 or thereabouts, they were built purely around firewalls. These days, there are software solutions as well. There's many vendors out there that have an SD-WAN stack that will work with a purely virtual environment. And pretty much every vendor has at least a partial software solution because the cloud providers need a software solution in order. And using firewalling and SD-WAN together absolutely works together. Now, before I move on to DNS, the domain name system, any questions that we think we'd like to cover here?
More questions. Is it possible to do QoS over SD-WAN?
Absolutely, yes. Quality of service is absolutely supported through SD-WAN. That same ability to see applications and content and users also means you can prioritize that same information and deprioritize it as well. In fact, quality of service in an SD-WAN is in many cases more fine-grained than it is in a traditional network.
Right. On the same topic, why is SD-WAN best effort?
Mostly because your typical internet service provider is best effort.
Right.
So unless you've paid a lot of money, most internet service providers, think about in Australia, the typical NBN connection. There's no guarantee of availability at all. If it's down, then, well, that's a shame, is really the approach.
In SD-WAN, is the speed always less than 1 gigabit per second?
No, that is a generalization that I used. It can be up to 10 or even 100 gigabits per second, but obviously at those higher speeds, the line starts to blur between SD-WAN and a traditional WAN as to which is going to make more sense.
Okay. When you say higher isolation within a WAN, do you, for example, mean VoIP traffic is separated to HTTP traffic? Is that because of VLANs or IP addressing?
I mean, yes to both. It is because you are far more able to separate, for example, your voice traffic and your web traffic. And typically you would use a combination of factors. You'd use VLAN style constructs, so tunnels within the SD-WAN to keep traffic separate, but you'd also be using IP address markers. You'd be using user IDs, application IDs, and content IDs to keep that traffic separate.
Okay, last SD-WAN question and we'll move on again. If SD-WAN looks into layer 7 content, does it slow down the traffic or does it keep some sort of session ID going to process it fast?
That is an excellent question. I love it. So does it slow down traffic? That depends on the manufacturer and the architectural decisions made by in this case, the firewall vendor, since we're talking about SD-WAN in a firewall context. The long and the short of it is that a well-designed architecture will not cause a slowdown because that sort of data processing is done with other security-related activities at the same time. Now, let me just look at the rest of that question. I'm just pulling it back up so I can read it, make sure I answer it completely. There is a fast process data path as well, though, that is involved in this, that once some flow-related decisions have been made, they don't need to be made again within that flow. So each time a packet comes in, there's certain things that do not need to be reevaluated. But in short, though, a well-designed firewall and therefore a well-designed SD-WAN solution won't see an impost in speed because of layer 7 content inspection being enabled.
Great. Okay, let's keep it going.
Awesome. DNS, domain name system, which is, we'll get into what it is in a moment, but there's a nice little haiku here that means a lot to me and means a lot to a lot of system administrators who've had problems with DNS in the past. Given that many of the internet's biggest failings have been due to DNS causing issues.
As someone who has worked in IoT over telecoms networks, I can totally appreciate this.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what is DNS for those that are not familiar? Think of it as a distributed phone book. It's a way that a name that is relatively familiar to those of us that speak English, such as www.paloaltonetworks.com, can be converted into a number that a computer recognizes. And back again, by the way. It is a two-way phone book. So unlike the white pages, which only allows you to take a name and look up a phone number, this also allows you to look up a phone number, in this case an IP address, and in many cases come back with a name that means something. Hopefully the same, but in many cases not the same. Now, DNS doesn't just provide names to numbers or numbers to names. It provides a range of other records that are all relevant to various functions of the working internet. So things like mail exchanges, MX records they're called, that basically say who's handling email for a given host or a given domain. There's canonical name records, which allow you to essentially consider that a thesaurus. So not only is this address at this host, but these other names are also known at this host. Similar to in the white pages, where you might, look up multiple names and they all point to the same phone number. Now, within domain names, within DNS, we have this concept of what's called a fully qualified domain name, or an FQDN. Now, a full FQDN is made up of, in this case, 4 parts. There's a host name, the system itself that is, in this case, delivering the web content for paloaltonetworks.com. We're going to call that host www. There's the domain name itself, which is the bulk of the name in this case, Palo Alto Networks. There's then what's called a top-level domain, in this case, com. And then there's what's called an authority record, or an implied full stop that basically says this is the end of the address. Now, you can try this yourself on your own personal computer. If you go to www.paloaltonetworks.com or www.paloaltonetworks.com with a final full stop, they'll both go to the same record. They'll both go to the same website. And that's by design, because that, in most use cases, that final full stop is implied. So when all that's put together, you end up with a fully qualified domain name. Now, DNS, it's not secure in any meaningful sense of the word. It's cached, which basically what that means is that when you look up an address, the domain name server closest to you will, if it doesn't have that record, query the next closest to it and so on until it finally gets a result. And then it'll remember that result. It'll cache that result for a certain amount of time. That in turn allows a whole host of different attacks. We'll call them, broadly speaking, meddler in the middle attacks, where you can what's called poison the cache and basically cause DNS to return a record that is not actually accurate. That in turn, combined with a whole bunch of different attacks, allows you to potentially misrepresent a particular host as, say, being your local bank, and getting people's passwords out of it without them being any the better aware. There is some work in the form of what's called DNSSEC, DNS security, that is designed to solve this through cryptographic methods. But unfortunately, there's a lot of DNS servers out there and a lot of hosts that have not yet implemented DNSSEC. And as such, until they do, there are some fairly serious security challenges within DNS. On top of that, DNS is very, very good at providing data. That's its job. Now, that data can be misused. You can hide information in that data. You can send a query to a DNS server that includes a bunch of information that maybe should not leave a particular network. Or you can use it to tunnel information back in by crafting particular queries. So with all this in mind, there are absolutely within modern next generation firewalls a range of different techniques used to both identify when DNS is being misused like this, but also to mitigate those threats and attacks. Before I move on to Internet of Things, any questions that have come up and need to be asked?
How does, there's a couple of SD-WANs. How does SD-WAN analyze and prioritize traffic, and what are the bandwidth constraints?
I'm going to use one of my favorite phrases here. It depends. So analysis and prioritization of traffic is very much done based on a business policy framework. So typically SD-WAN will use the same next generation firewall functionality that we've described last week to do the actual analysis. The prioritization is based on what the business needs and wants for it. The bandwidth constraints in some are the minimum capacity of the smallest link between any two sites. So if you've got one site connected at 100 megabits per second and 4 sites connected at a gigabit per second, then obviously any traffic destined for the slowest site is going to be constrained to that slowest link at 100 megabits per second.
Okay, DNS poisoning, a couple of questions on that. How can we prevent it? Can you explain a little bit about it? And also, well, is there any way to stop or lock DNS to avoid poisoning?
So, yeah, DNS poisoning, realistically, it's very, very hard to completely mitigate without using techniques like DNSSEC. So the simplest thing that you can do as an enterprise IT admin or an enterprise DNS admin is to ensure that your DNS records are all signed using DNSSEC. That in turn prevents a third party from modifying them without that modification being detected. Using known and trusted DNS resolvers is also very advisable. Many people use, say, 8.8.8.8 or 1.1.1.1. Nothing wrong with that for personal use, but in an enterprise sense, it's generally not a great idea. They're probably the main things. From a firewalling point of view, many next generation firewalls have the ability to correlate the requests that a particular inside host is making with what the host thinks it's talking to. So it might think you're going to yourbank.com. The firewall can generally detect, provided it's configured correctly, that yourbank.com is not actually being served up by the host that should be returning yourbank.com.
Okay. A couple of questions about the relationships of DKIM, SPF, and DMARC functions to DNS.
So they're all payloads that DNS provides that allow a host or a network to communicate with other networks. It's posture when it comes to things like email security and email cryptography. Long and the short of it there is that they don't really deal with DNS vulnerabilities themselves. DNSSEC is very much, I'm going to almost call it the silver bullet when it comes to DNS, DNS poisoning and DNS attacks more generally. Whereas DMARC, DKIM, and SPF are all designed to predominantly deal with spam and with unauthorized mail hosts claiming to be authorized to send email on behalf of a given organization.
Okay, I think we should probably keep on going. Got a
Yep.
pile of questions, but
Cool. No worries. All right, so now we're going to get into Internet of Things. Now, IoT is a real challenge from a security point of view. There's quite a lot that's been written on the topic, and for good reason. And IoT devices more generally are probably the biggest security challenge, the biggest general security challenge when it comes to the regular internet. I'm not talking about targeted attacks against organizations at this point. I'm talking about general security headaches for all of us. So when I talk about Internet of Things, I'm talking about anything that involves a machine-to-machine communication. So two devices talking to each other that probably doesn't directly involve the interactions of a human being. So that might be an internet-connected fridge talking to the cloud to let you know via a push message that you need to change the water filter. That might be an IR blaster for your air conditioner that will turn the air conditioner on automatically once the temperature in the room hits a certain level, or turn it off again after a certain amount of time. Various security cameras, both well-known brands and otherwise. Room presence sensors that tell you whether there's someone in the room. All of these are essentially IoT devices of some type. Around 2019, there was about 27 billion devices. I haven't been able to validate the most recent figures since 5 years ago, but the most reliable figure that I was able to find pointed to a tripling in that figure. So close to 75 billion devices connected to the internet in that note. Now, IoT devices, the reason I referred to them as a bit of a security headache is that generally once they're installed, they're more or less forgotten about. They're often unpatched. They're particularly older versions very rarely used any form of encryption because encryption's computationally expensive and these devices are fairly cheap. And they're generally neglected. They're left insecure. They're left connected to generally less secured networks. And as a result, attackers love them. They can get access to them generally very easily. Now, while in themselves they might not have a lot of compute horsepower, once you connect 1,000 of them together into a botnet, into a distributed denial of service attack, those individual little pieces of traffic do stack up pretty quickly. There's lots of different ways that IoT devices get connected to, well, the internet. Might be through physical wire, Ethernet connection. Wi-Fi is not uncommon. LTE or 3G or 4G or 5G networks are also not uncommon. And that same fact that they're often unpatched means that they're often very, very insecure. So as of 2019, 83% of the world's medical imaging devices, which yes are a form of IoT, were running an unsupported operating system. Windows NT4 was apparent in some platforms. Windows ME was also apparent. Now in 2019, that quite frankly, if that doesn't frighten you, then my humble opinion is that it should. And 51% of the security threats in a medical environment involve imaging devices of some type. And in some medical environments, Conficker, which was a vulnerability circa late 2008, is still a problem, even now in 2024. This is obviously a huge problem. On top of that, a lot of organizations don't take the steps required to isolate these devices. Now, knowing what you now know in terms of the vulnerability profile of a common or garden IoT device, you would probably agree it makes sense to keep these things on a very, very separate network. Certainly not put them on the same network as, say, your critical infrastructure. But many healthcare environments, 72% of healthcare LANs, still mix both, say, medical imaging devices or automated drips or similar, and their standard IT assets, printers, PCs, servers that have critical medical data on them. And this is just healthcare that we're talking about. Healthcare is one of the better environments from a security point of view. So this gives you a sense of the problem that we face here with IoT. Now that I've frightened you, what are the best practices? How do we stop this being a problem? The simplest way, and the bare minimum from my point of view, is to make sure that IoT devices are on a separate network, on a separate LAN. So that might be a VLAN, a virtual LAN, but either way, keep them separate. Put them behind a firewall of their own. So that might be that you use a firewall as a router, and you have a VLAN behind that just for IoT devices. And the only way that those IoT devices can talk to anything in the rest of your network is through that firewall, and only with that firewall's permission. You can then go further and say, well, this particular IoT device, really, let's use Sensibo as an example, and I'm not picking on them. I use their devices myself. Should it really be talking to anything other than sensibo.com? If not, lock it down. Tell the firewall, this device can only talk to these other hosts, and that's all. Or these other domains, for example. And the big thing is, if your IoT devices come with patches, unfortunately, many manufacturers essentially neglect them the day they come out. But if your manufacturer provide patches, put them on. And obviously, if you have a choice between two vendors and one has a track record of providing updates and the other doesn't, it would be my advice to consider the one that provides the updates. Any questions before we move on to software versus hardware, which was a big topic from last week's forum?
There, not really. I think we can. Keep going because we're still on DNS questions and the rest
Yeah,
at the
cool.
moment.
No
And
worries.
there's lots we could talk about with IoT stuff and the difficulty of
Absolutely.
patching stuff over the air. I think a lot of people try and substitute telecom networks for security as
They
well.
absolutely do, and that's a big thing. I mean, as I said, you can put them on, LTE networks, on put a SIM card in them and connect them to the internet that way. That doesn't make the security problem go away in any sense of the word.
No.
So,
Although the update issue does get fixed every time the networks change from 2G to 3G to 4G, and that
yes,
cycle
yeah,
is getting
it's
faster.
forced obsolescence is great in that sense. The other thing is too that, at least from a network connectivity point of view, so a modem point of view, the telcos do have the ability to enforce certain modem firmwares, and in many cases will do so, and they'll actually push new firmware out to your device if you refuse to, or they'll boot it off the network. So.
And they use VPNs most of the time as well.
Yeah,
Well, most
most telcos will provide some sort of VPN for those devices. So let's talk about software versus hardware. This topic came up a bit in the forums during the week, and I did provide to a couple of those questions, some very high-level summaries, but it's worth going into in more detail. And all of this is sort of the glue, as it were, to some of the decisions that you'd make when deciding which platforms to use. Now, obviously, in the last sort of 15 years or so, we've seen a big uptake in virtualization. Obviously, VMware has been around for the best part of a quarter century now. I was first using VMware back in about 2000. And it's there for a good reason. Virtualization is a very, very useful tool to maximize the utilization of computing assets within an environment. So rather than buying a single server and running a single application on it and having it sit around doing nothing for most of the time, you can use that same physical device for multiple applications while still maintaining separation between them. But that poses a bit of a problem for security, because the best place to run a firewall, the best place to perform network security, is as close to the source as you can achieve. So in the best of all possible worlds, you have your firewall sitting, well, right next to your server. But what if your server is actually 20 servers in one? in that case, the best place to do it is actually inside the virtual environment itself. Now, you can go to to some pretty extreme lengths here. You can potentially use a process called microsegmentation, where, let's say you've got a containerized based solution. You could go to the extent of putting one containerized firewall or one virtual firewall in front of each application. Is that a good idea? It depends. It's very much a case of what are you protecting, and how valuable is it? And is it worth the additional overhead and, yes, cost of doing so? But in any case, once you get into the cloud, if you want firewalling, if you want that level of network security, then you absolutely need a software firewall. And indeed, the big cloud providers have their own software firewall solutions here, that have a range of different functionalities and features. But similarly, all of the major network security vendors also provide a software firewall that is designed for use in those sorts of cloud environments. Now, these solutions, they scale horizontally. That is to say, if you need more capacity, you turn up more virtual firewalls. So you divide and conquer. You would use one firewall or a small number of firewalls on a application by application basis. And as your performance needs increase, you basically spin up more rather than trying to spin up bigger. Now, software is software. It's not as quick as hardware as a very general rule, which in turn means that typically with a software firewall, you're not going to want to try to push more than 10 gigabits per second of traffic through it. And in many cases, that's going to really test your relationship somewhat. And as well, you're not going to be able to support as many routes or as many flows or any of the other scaling figures that are relevant when you're talking about building a large firewalled environment. Now, we compare and contrast that to hardware. Firewalls are typically built on dedicated silicon rather than basically running as a virtual operating system within a standard Linux or x86 Intel server. That gives them very, very, very high performance and very specialized performance, particularly measured, say, per watt of consumed electricity. So where a typical server might get you 10 gigabits per second out of, say, 500 watt hours, 500 watt hours, half a kilowatt hour of usage, out of the same half kilowatt of electricity, you can potentially see 10 to 20 times the performance out of a dedicated hardware device. And similarly, the scale goes up from there. So a large chassis firewall can get well into the hundreds of gigabits per second of reliable throughput, which is just not something you do with a single software firewall. And while software firewalls basically come in a limited number of flavors and all of them are naturally virtual, hardware firewalls come in quite a wide range of physical tin, everything from enterprise grade or industrial grade devices designed for mounting in difficult environments, right up to massive devices that you might see in the bottom of a rack data center somewhere. Now, hardware firewalls, though, are pretty expensive, to put it mildly, particularly if you need multiples of them. So typically for redundancy, you might buy 2 of them, and that can get pretty eye-wateringly expensive. So as ever, there is a trade-off here. For raw performance, you probably are going to look at hardware firewalls, but there's going to be a budgetary consideration to take into play there too. Now, before I move on, I've just spotted a question that I'd love to answer, which is, are there any security solutions built specifically for IoT devices? Absolutely, yes. Many vendors have a IoT specific solution stack, and that typically would look at things like whether the device in question is behaving the way it should. So using a profile for a given IoT device and saying, well, that device is known to need to talk to X, Y, Z, but it's actually talking to A, B, and C, so therefore there's a problem, as well as a bunch of other isolation related techniques to prevent it, say, talking to other devices within the local area network. And what makes the design of IoT devices not to be designed with security in mind from inception? Cost. That's a pure cost discussion.
And the complexity, often they're designed for a very small throughput.
They're simple, they're cheap, and the manufacturers, once they've put them out in the wild, really don't want to think about them anymore because they've gone on to something else, is often how it goes. So absolutely, yes. Shane, there's a question for you there, if you want to take it. It's up to you.
Which one's that? Oh, about the
what-
biggest challenge, patching
with
IoT
patching, yes.
devices. Well, I suppose there's so many, really, isn't it? Oh, the things that we used to counter, and we were dealing with network-based IoT devices, telco network ones, was making sure you actually got them all done within a reasonable frame of time.
Yes.
You know, dealing with simple things like power outage cycles on the devices. We had a client who had 200,000 devices in America, and they'd forgotten to put a reboot cycle in.
Oh no!
And the network lost them.
Yeah.
They said, "Oh, have you noticed that 60% of your devices go off air over a period of 18 months?" No. Things like that.
Yeah. So that's a pretty common one. Vic, you've asked if connecting IoT devices to a guest network, if it's safe. It's safer than connecting it to a corporate network, but I wouldn't call it safe. My preferred best practice approach would be to have a separate or multiple separate, depending on the use case, IoT networks, which is separate to both guest and to corporate or enterprise network use cases. And this, from a network point of view, is generally fairly easy to do. And typically in a firewalling sense would just involve having a separate security zone dedicated to IoT devices or subclasses of IoT devices. If we take a large hospital, for example, it's entirely feasible that you'd have separate IoT networks for, say, the imaging devices versus the the drip line machines, for example.
I think it's time, Ian, to do the paid political advertisement.
Yeah, please do.
So look, apologies in advance, everybody, but we only do really one of these per course, and it's really just a little bit of a blurb about IT Masters, particularly for those of you who are either in Australia or interested in studying in an Australian university. The real reason, or one of the reasons that we put these short courses on, is that they're related to our master's degree courses. So the content for this course, for example, not only relates to a Palo Alto certificate, it also relates to some of our subjects in either cybersecurity or cloud or networking. And that's why over a period of time, if you actually do the exams on 3 of these subjects, you can get a credit against one of our subjects in one of our paid master's degrees. The master's degrees are actually issued by Charles Sturt University, who are our partner, and they teach half of the courses. So we teach half the subjects and Charles Sturt teach them. So on our hand, we have people like Ian who have been working in the industry for years, teaching the subjects, and Charles Sturt give you an academic view of things. You get the best of both worlds. And I think if you're doing this sort of short course, you might be interested in either our cybersecurity, grad certs or masters, or our cloud or networking. We also do an MBA, which is a little bit unique and specifically designed for IT professionals, because it's designed so that you can actually do the core MBA subjects, which are all around management details and how to run large organizations. But then you're allowed to specialize in something like cybersecurity or project management or cloud, etc. So you get the ability to do all of that. Paul, so IT Masters is based in Australia, and it's owned by a company called ECA, but we're 50% partners with Charles Sturt in their degrees that we offer. And you can get more information about that. Lil is busy plugging things into the chat as we go along. We've been doing this for 20 years now. Since 2002 was the first time we ran a course. And the people that started the business actually came out of corporate education. I think Dimension Data was one of the places they'd worked, and also Telstra, for those of you in Australia. And it was designed from the very start with trying to help people who had gone into IT being able to do things operationally and really understanding IT, but not having the relevant bits of paper to be able to understand, to get ahead in their career, essentially. So that's been the main driver of what we have done over the past 20 years. We're there to provide very good master's degrees for people that can, want to get ahead in their career or want to expand their learning or want to keep up to date, because we do try very hard to keep up to date. It's often a bit complex because there's quite a process. And thank you, Ben, for recommending our course. It's nice to see that. But yeah, that's generally what we do. And I don't want to take too much of your time, but just have a look at itmasters.edu.au and you'll see a little bit more about what you want, what we are doing at the moment. And yes, CSP, the certs aren't, the graduate certificates, yes, a lot of the technical ones are covered by CSP for domestic students. And in fact, we have a number of pathways developed where you can do a series of graduate certificates on the way to doing a master's as a way of getting you through your master's faster and saving a bit of money along the way, because we would rather have people that went through and got their master's than spend a whole lot of money. So I would encourage you to have a look at those things that Lil's been putting in the list. And by all means, have a chat to one of our course advisors, because they will be able to tell you all of that sort of stuff. And the master's depends, it's 12 subjects. So you can do it at your own pace. Most people do about 1 to 2 subjects. I think the average is about 1.25 subjects per session, and there's 3 sessions a year. So you can divide it out as much as you like. Some people do it much more quickly. And of course, a number of people have also credits that they can apply. You can get credits for not only industry certificates like CCNA will give you a couple of credits, for example, or CISM or CISP, they will all give you credits towards our courses. But also if you're an ACS certified professional or certified technician, that can give you credits in our course as well. And in fact, if you've been working in the industry for a while, I highly recommend and want to do one of our degrees, I highly recommend the ACS route, because it is the only investment I know that pays you back between 5 and 10 times what you invest in it, because essentially you can get a $4,000 subject for the cost of $700 by doing the certification process, which is pretty easy. All of that stuff, please feel free to have a chat to us about at any point. But I'm going to shut the hell up now and turn it back over to you, Ian, who is, by the way, one of our graduates.
I was just about to say, yeah, thank you, Shane. And yes, as a bit of a plug myself to confirm what Shane has just said, I've gone through the IT Masters program twice so far, and I'm currently also studying an MBA computing through IT Masters as well. So I find it works for me. And yeah, I can echo what Shane has just said. On to IDS and IPS. There's already been a couple of IDS IPS questions, so let's talk about the differences and how they fit in the context of a next generation firewall. Before I do that, though, just very quickly, just a note, if either Lily or Shane, you could remind me afterwards. There was a really good question from Sankaran about sharing a good link about DNSSEC. I'll put that in the forums afterwards, as long as I'm reminded to do so.
We will.
Thank you so much. All right, IDS, IPS, intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. Now, seen a few people ask the question of what are they, how do they fit in? And that's exactly what we'll talk about right now for the next couple of slides. So first of all, we have the concept of an intrusion detection system. Now, these are an older generation of security concepts. They're still in use. They're certainly not old in the sense of have passed their prime, but they're certainly not as commonly deployed these days as maybe they were in the 90s, 2000s, and even the 2010s. Essentially what they do is they sit there and they listen to everything on the network. So typically you put them in line on the network. They appear as what we would call a bump in the wire. via an optical tap. So essentially a one-way pathway upon which traffic comes into them. They don't actually interact with that traffic. They just listen to it as a big ear. And they basically just look at everything that goes past. They look at whether there are threats or exploits in that traffic. They often use some sort of rules-based engine, so very much anomaly, but rules-based, pattern-based. Sometimes, though, they will look at anomalies, so they'll know what normal looks like, and when something isn't normal, they'll report on it. If you know your network very well, or it's a very high security environment, you may well use an anomaly-based engine there. They, however, are not designed to prevent an attack from taking place. They'll sound the alarm. They're the equivalent of having an alarm on your front door. They'll tell you when somebody opens it, but they will not stop it happening. And typically, they'll provide their reports through to a SIEM, which we will cover in week 4. Now, compare and contrast to an intrusion prevention system. These don't get connected via an optical tap. They're always connected inline. So if you've got, say, a switch connected to a router, you might put an intrusion prevention system between the two. Or if you're using a next generation firewall, you might combine the two functions into a single physical piece of hardware. What these do is they inspect everything that like an IDS does, and they often use the same approach, the rules-based approach. Sometimes they'll use anomaly-based detection methods as well. And unlike the example of the alarm, where someone breaks into your front door and an alarm goes off and tells you that it's happened, these will actually provide some form of active prevention in many cases. So in the case of a network, that would be a case of, once you detect bad traffic, dropping it, resetting the connection so that the devices stop talking to each other, blocking the traffic in some other mechanism, maybe making a copy of it for forensic purposes. And like an IDS, they will also provide their reports to some form of incident and event management system. Now, which would you deploy and when? So generally speaking, unless you have a legislative requirement, as some organizations do, to deploy an intrusion detection system, you would be better off with an intrusion prevention system. It's one thing to have an alarm that tells you that there's a problem. There's another thing to stop the attack happening in the first place. And since an IPS will both block and report, it's obviously a better option in many use cases. Now, having said that, if your network performance is a problem, you may want to use an IPS in tap mode. That is to say, to use it as a bump in the wire. That turns it into an intrusion detection system. Its ability to prevent attacks will be somewhat minimal in that use case. But if you're more concerned about getting traffic through quickly, then that is always an option. And there are ways to use an intrusion prevention system in that mode. It typically involves having an upstream system, such as a security incident and event management system, set rules on other devices to drop the traffic elsewhere in your network if there's a detected threat. But in case it isn't entirely clear, most next generation firewalls can also provide either intrusion detection or intrusion prevention functionality without necessarily acting as a full firewall at the same time. So many firewalls provide a virtual wire function where they can, rather than providing routing or switching functionality, layer 2 or layer 3, they essentially look to the rest of the world like just a, copper connection between two devices, but one that will quite happily, step in and drop traffic if it sees something it doesn't like the look of. So using them as a pure IPS is perfectly valid. Using them in a more traditional firewall role with IPS functionality as well is also perfectly valid. Virtual private networks, so VPNs. Now, we've already talked about software-defined wide area networks, and I alluded in that section to the use of VPNs as a part of that solution. So now we'll talk about what a VPN is and why it matters. Now, many of you will already have used or do use a VPN every day. But I suspect there'll be a couple of things in this next slide that might actually surprise you a little bit. But before we do get onto that, is there any questions at all around IDS or IPS that I hadn't already answered?
What role does it play in next gen security? You've potentially answered that, I think.
Yeah, it's part of an end-to-end solution. All of these components are, useful in their own right, of course, but are predominantly designed to be used as part of a defense in depth strategy where you don't rely purely on firewalling for firewalling's sake. You would also look at, lateral threats. You'd look at evidence of intrusion as well, and so on as well.
What good IPS solutions have you seen so far for the traditional modern network setups?
So the best ones I've seen have typically been integrated with a next generation firewall solution. So there's many different vendors, Palo Alto being one, that have good IPS solutions as part of their solution stack. There are older IPS only solutions from a few vendors such as Packet Logic, the Packet Logic device from Pacera Networks, for example, which does a really good job as a pure IPS. But as I say, these days, if you're using a next generation firewall, the use of those sorts of platforms is not necessarily not valuable, but certainly less valuable than having an end-to-end stack.
In IPS, you mentioned it will first detect, then prevent. Just a basic query in cybersecurity. Does detect always happen before prevent in all security devices, or is it first prevent, then detect?
That is an absolutely excellent question. I love that question for two reasons. So if you're dealing reactively with a security threat, then yes, you have to detect the threat before you can prevent it. So most modern firewalls will continually assess traffic as it passes through and determine whether that traffic is good, bad, or otherwise as it goes. And therefore, something that starts out looking benign might start to look very not benign and get dropped accordingly partway through the conversation. Now that's normal, that's good, that's exactly expected behavior. That does raise the hairs on the back of some people's necks because it does imply that there's going to be some parts of that not benign conversation that happen before the firewall steps in and says that's enough of that. Now, having said that, prevention is, of course, worth 1,000 cures, as it were. And prevention doesn't just mean preventing a technical attack as it's occurring. It also means stopping the theoretical attacks before they occur. So ensuring that security policies and security postures are set appropriately in the first place to attack as purely academic in the first place.
I think we should probably keep on going because I'm
Yep.
noticing it's now after 10 to 9 and we normally like to get out of here by 9, but
Yes.
we have 40 questions sitting there as well.
All good. I've only got 4 slides left, so we're getting to the end now. So virtual private networks. So as I said, most of you will be familiar with these. You will have used these. You may use these daily, in fact. In summary, we normally think of them as providing secure connectivity over an insecure network. But that's not exactly true. A virtual private network doesn't need to provide encryption, and it may not be provided over an insecure network. It may be provided over a secure network. It's perfectly possible to have, say, a secure network, let's say in the government or defense sense, that has an even more secure network inside it. That doesn't make the secure network that's doing the carriage of traffic somehow insecure. It just makes it slightly less secure in that context. And conversely, if you've got traffic that you really don't care about, but you want to keep separate, or there's something special about it that means that you need to, what I'm going to call, tunnel it between two sites, you might provide an insecure tunnel over an insecure network as well. Both of those are valid. I've configured as anything in security goes, there's a lot of it depends going on here. So, but as a general rule, we think of virtual private networks as providing security over an insecure medium like the internet. Now, that in turn means that you typically use encryption to provide confidentiality in a virtual private network, but you don't have to. It's perfectly possible to send everything in the clear if you want to. It's also perfectly possible to double encrypt it if you have the need for some reason. Maybe your underlying network uses an encryption technique like MACsec to encrypt the underlying network, and you might choose to put something over the top of that as well. Now, there's two common flavors for a virtual private network. There's what's called site to site, which is from router to router, say between two corporate offices or two campuses over the internet. That's very much what SD-WAN does in summary. And then there's the remote access VPN, where you typically have a piece of software on your computer that connects to a security device and provides you a virtual connection to that. And yes, in both cases, you're typically going to be using a next generation firewall for one or both ends of that link. Where does VPN come in? Well, SD-WAN uses VPN. Zero Trust Network Access, which we will talk about in a future week, uses VPN technology to do what it does. It basically tunnels and protects everything everywhere on the basis that it can't trust anything. The ZT means zero trust for a reason. And many managed wide area networks from common service providers use VPNs, but often in the unencrypted, unprotected sense. What's called an IP VPN, an Internet Protocol VPN. And chances are, if you use a modern mobile phone from any of the major manufacturers, you're already using a VPN every single time you turn that thing on, because most of them now switch on browser anonymization by default, and that uses VPN functionality. That's us done. So are there any questions left in the chat that we want to catch up on?
Well, there are 40 questions here, and I'm going to apologize immediately because we're not going to get it through them all.
Yeah.
But let's just chew through a few, knowing that we have only really until 9 o'clock. We have had a long session today. Do we need two configs when a next generation firewall with IPS is deployed?
So I'm going to interpret that question as meaning if you're using a next-gen firewall in an intrusion protection role as well, do you need two configs? In that context, the answer is no, because you can think of IPS in that use case as being a subset of the functionality of a next-generation firewall. If you're using them as separate devices, say you've got two virtual systems running within the firewall, and one is providing purely IPS type functionality, the other is providing, a more full stack solution, then yes, you're going to have two configs in that use case.
Okay, is a VPN or IPS more secure?
So they're actually different technologies. So a VPN will provide more point-to-point security, so data in transit security, as it were, whereas an IPS will provide your network security. Think of it as the difference between, say, a security guard providing that, first line defense and response when the alarm goes off, when the IDS tells it that there's a problem, and the use of an encrypted phone call or similar to actually communicate with that guard.
Okay, do VPNs or can VPNs handle split tunneling, and what's the security implication of allowing or restricting that in the corporate environment?
I love that question. That's another brilliant question. Well done, Kanal. So VPNs, the way they handle split tunnel typically involves fairly complicated routing rules on the devices that are involved in the VPN. So typically you'd have a default route out through the VPN that says anything that needs to go to the internet goes one way, and anything that goes out to, say, the local network goes another way, or indeed vice versa, or indeed you might have a bunch of specific network addresses, specific routes for, say, corporate devices that go on there. Now, probably the biggest security implication of a split tunnel approach, that split tunneling is great when you need things like access to a local printer. And in fact, it's entirely necessary if you need access to, say, a local printer. But the trade-off there is if you can, from a device, talk to something on a local network, that also means that potentially malware can do the same. So obviously, split tunneling does, in that sense, potentially reduce the security posture of the overall environment, because if someone manages to move laterally and break into that laptop, say through a compromised device on that home local area network, then almost by definition, they've now also got access to anything at the other end of that same VPN.
Okay, I'm going to say that we will do 2 more questions. And again, we've got 42 here. They will be to some extent, some of them will get answered in the forums, and some will be, we'll probably go past in the future.
And yes, so a lot of these that I've seen will be answered in week 3 and 4. So
okay. What are the security risks associated with patching?
that's a brilliant question. I love that one. So obviously patches, like any software, can in themselves introduce vulnerabilities. Now patches are generally provided to fix a vulnerability, but it's not been uncommon for a patch in itself to introduce one, and or for there to be an unintended consequence of applying that patch. I can think of a few cases, and in fact, there's one that involves IoT devices that comes to mind, where there was a vulnerability to do with the way a certain class of very common home router connected to particular internet servers called network time protocol servers. And that in itself was causing an inadvertent denial of service attack on those public servers. When the manufacturer in question finally pushed out a patch to fix the problem, they actually inadvertently introduced a bug which made those devices capable of generating a very malicious denial of service attack instead of the inadvertent one that they were trying to patch. So that's the sort of thing that can happen. Like any software, yes, patching is essential. Yes, patching needs to be done. But in a high security or a high sensitivity environment, you would always want to assess those patches on their merits and probably put them into a, into a canary or a pre-prod environment before deploying them.
Okay, lucky last, is there any country that has any regulations in regards to DNSSEC setups?
At this stage, I'm not aware of any. I know there's a lot of industry and internet community push to have DNSSEC enabled across the board, but I'm personally not aware of any legislative push in any particular country to make that happen. And I'm not, I'm not sure how that would work either, because in a lot of cases, if you think about cloud use, for example, who's responsible for enforcing it? Is it the location of the server, or is it the location of the organization using the server?
Paul, your question on phishing we'll get to later, and I think a lot of the other ones we will cover off in the future. We do keep a copy of the questions, so you will be aware that we have the ability to look at them in the future. But I would really like to thank everybody for attending tonight. I know we've gone a little bit over time. We do try and keep it to about an hour for the presentation and half an hour for questions, but your questions have been so good and so many that it makes it a little bit complex at times. But I would by all means encourage you to continue asking those questions, get on the forums, log into the system, chat amongst each other. A lot of the times you guys out there have the answers to the questions as well. We are by no means the the sole authority on anything to do with this. A lot of the people who come to these are really smart people who have been doing this stuff for years as well, and we appreciate them coming along. So big thanks to Lil for handling all of the chat tonight. Thanks to everyone for coming along, and especially to you, Ian, and I look forward to next week.
Not a problem. We'll see you all in 7 days' time.
No problem. Night, everybody.
Thank you very much.